to Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for a Stateless Society. I'm your host, Zachary Woodman. Joining me today is Shikha Dalmia. Shikha is a former policy analyst for the Reason Foundation and has had her writing appear in publications such as Bloomberg View, Reason Magazine, The Week, The Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. I wanted to have a conversation with her about two key issues she has spent a lot of time thinking about from a libertarian perspective as we move on from the Trump era: immigration and populism. In this discussion, we start with a philosophical discussion about what our priorities should be in reaction to the rise of populist authoritarian movements, whether we should move more radically to seek to protect the rights of those they try to violate, or, as Shikha suggests, prioritize the non-ideal theoretic strategy of controlling damage to liberal democratic institutions. We also discuss the possible causes of populist authoritarian movements and how they have corroded even possible sources of resistance to such movements, such as the American Libertarian movement. We also discuss the rise of populism by taking a close look at India and a bit about how Biden should move forward on liberalizing immigration reform. This was a great informative discussion, and I hope you enjoy listening to it much as I enjoyed having it. So without further ado, here is Shikha Dalmia. Hello and welcome to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. Joining me today is Shikha Dalmia. How are you doing?
I'm well, Zachary. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so I wanted to have a discussion about, now that we are sort of in this weird space of trying to get over the last 4 years / figure out if we are even moving on from the last 4 years. You have written quite a lot about some issues pertaining to populism, both globally and in the US, and immigration policy. So I figured you'd be the right person to have on to get those issues, to figure out what's going on with respect to that stuff from a more libertarian perspective. So I guess before we get into it, just a little bit about yourself. What got you into sort of political commentary and sort of influenced you to have the ideological views that you have?
Just by way of biography, I grew up in India, and this was in the 70s, 60s, 70s. And India at that time was a rather strange place. I mean, I didn't realize it at that time, but in retrospect, it was a weird combination of modern and traditional. It was modern in some ways in that the latest intellectual currents in the West had already reached India. And Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, who was quite in touch with sort of continental intellectual currents, had thought Fabian socialism is the way to go for India. Not sort of the Soviet-style communism, but Fabian socialism, where you have central planners who are controlling the market and the industry and deciding on, and control the commanding heights of the economy. But you also have a fair amount of free enterprise. And at the same time, India was also culturally an extremely traditional society, and it still is to a very large extent. And with the traditional part of it, you get a very, very strong communitarianism. I mean, community is everything. Your family is everything. Your extended family is everything. And which also means that there is a great deal of control on the individual. What's good for the family and what's good for the unit that you inhabit is good for you. And you are expected to pay a lot of deference to the goals of the family. You're responsible for your family, you're responsible for your unit. And so it's a sort of like, for an individual, it's, there's a fair amount of stultification, especially if you're a woman in a patriarchal traditional society. It means a lot of control on your life. And I was chafing under that really more than socialism when I discovered in my very early teens, 14, 15 years old, Ayn Rand. And she kind of hit me like a ton of bricks, because she has this very powerful message that your life is your own to lead and you don't owe anybody anything. Your job is your own personal happiness, your own self-actualization. And that was a powerful message at that time. And it's still a powerful message, to a very large extent, although now I'm much more mindful, of the sort of the need for thick-knit communities and the sense of meaning and identity they give to individuals. I still very much think an individual rights approach where the political power and methodological individualism of the Austrians is important, and that's kind of like my central political schema. On the other hand, on a cultural, sociological level, I do I'm more mindful of the way thick-knit communities are able to provide meaning in the life of individuals in a way that atomization doesn't do. So, so I'm sort of at some kind of an intellectual crossroads at this time. And that's one reason.
Yes, that's really interesting. You're trying to find a way to make a more individualist libertarian outlook mesh with like the insights that someone like Charles Taylor or other communitarians would want to have. So like to that end, you mentioned you're at an intellectual crossroads. How would you describe your political views, maybe with some boilerplate terminology and elaboration? Like what variant of libertarianism do you feel captures that idea of balancing the need to respect individual rights with community membership and meaningful spheres of collective belonging?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. And I'm not sure I have any really very worked out answers. What I do know is, the last 4 years have been politically so tumultuous. And one of the explanations for why Trump became such a big phenomenon, Frank Fukuyama is at the forefront of this. He's suggesting to some extent that this was an economic issue. He thinks it was this rising in income inequality, economic inequality has caused sort of the lower income people to rise up and question sort of the neoliberal establishment consensus. But the other thing that he mentions, and this part I take more seriously, is that it's an identity issue. That if you look at Western societies and the cultural upheaval that they have undergone, the very great mobility has left people, has deracinated people, and yet not formed and yet not offered them other sources of meaning. And so they are, so if you look at a lot of like Trump support and the general support for right-wing populism in the West, it tends, there is, I think, a bias on the direction of single white men, who don't have great prospects and who are also feeling at a loss in their life. And there is some segment of the Trump phenomenon and the general right-wing phenomenon that's explained by that. And so I do wonder if, if people like that had been embedded in more thickly knit communities where, you know who you are, you know your place in a certain kind of structure. And if you can find meaning in that, maybe there is something to that. But, you asked where I am politically and how do I describe my political affiliations. The weird thing is that in some ways I'm more conservative in the sense, a Burkean conservative, in the sense that I think liberal democracy, which is in trouble right now, and its traditions need to be shored up and protected more than ever. So in that sense, and the Trump phenomenon in that sense was a very radical phenomenon. It posed a very radical threat to our basic structures, political structures of liberal democracy. And I think those need to be strengthened and shored up. And in that sense, I guess I'm more of a conservative. On the other hand, I'm also more of a progressive in that, I think libertarians have given short shrift to all kinds of minority issues. They've prioritized a certain right-wing issue set, and there needs to be a core correction within classical liberalism. So weirdly, I'm combining sort of a Burkean conservatism with a progressive sensibility, if that makes any sense.
And like a libertarian moral outlook to boot. Right. So like if you were to ask, maybe you don't think ideal theory is the most useful way to approach the current populist issue, but like if you were to say sort of ideal theoretically, what would your ideal society look like? Would it be more liberal democracy, minarchist orientation, or more anarchist, or?
Yeah, this whole anarchist-minarchist debate among libertarians has always left me a little bit cold because, it's sort of breeds a certain kind of utopianism that, there is some libertarian utopia out there that's waiting to be realized if we can just kind of get the basic structure right. And I just don't think political life and human life works like that. We are always going to live in a certain kind of a messy political reality, which is going to be far from perfect. And right now, what the last few years have taught me is just that, the biggest need right now is to strengthen liberal democracy. And libertarians maybe because they have been so preoccupied with their own internal inside baseball conversations about minarchy and anarchy, they kind of didn't kind of realize this bigger threat that was brewing on the right. And this is relevant because, you know, even though this debate, minarchy, anarchy, left me cold, but what I saw it was always trying to sort of improve on the current political system that we have. Liberal democracy is very, very not a perfect solution. I mean, there are all kinds of compromises that it makes internally between different, you know, power structures, between different sources of regime. There is some, you know, meritocracy. There is some of this. So it's kind of like a very, very messy kind of like a system. And I always saw minarchy-anarchy debate as a way of sort of trying to perfect it, to trying to make it better. But what we've seen in the last few years is that there is this populist authoritarianism threat which just wants to take down liberal democracy without actually improving it. So right now, for me, my political project is to use resources from within classical liberalism to shore up liberal democracy. That's all I'm interested in doing.
Right.
There is no point in having a minarchy-anarchy debate when you have like an authoritarian and a fascist sitting, you know, in the most powerful country on the planet. It's all irrelevant to me right now. So for me, that's my, you know, number one political project.
Right. I mean, the thing I've always said to try to like respond to those points, because I think they're really good, has been, I think having a certain ideal theory can change your orientation to current political issues. Like, if you buy a more anarchist, you might be skeptical of political obligation, and that will lead you to recognize that certain ways that the state acts can be subject to more scrutiny, I think, than sort of someone who believed in political obligation or believed in the legitimacy of the state, even if they thought it was doing bad things, might have. And it would open you up to other ways of trying to fulfill some of the things liberal democracy has tried to do sort of outside the legal system. So do you think that that's just sort of secondary to the need to restrain the beast of the state as much as we possibly can, given the current sort of threat of a fascist controlling it?
You know, that's a good question. I mean, to me, the purpose, like you said, that these debates serve is that they, you know, present a normative lodestar. You know, even if we are never going to accomplish this utopia, just having that as a normative lodestar helps to kind of orient you. And I get that. I mean, that's kind of how I approach immigration, right? The trouble with it is that sometimes, you know, this sort of, we lose sight of the fact that this is only supposed to be a normative lodestar, and we start trying to hypnotize the escutcheon, so to speak, you know, here and now. And therefore, no reform. There is nothing, you know, in between in this transitional state. We stop asking questions about, you know, transitional points. Like, there is a path dependence. We have a system right now. And we didn't, just because, you know, the system is messy, it breeds a certain kind of radicalism and a utopianism in that we just want to bring it down here and now, because using this to move somewhere else will not yield to a perfect solution. And whatever, you know, I mean, whatever the relevance of these debates for us internal purposes, you know, when we thought a basic edifice was secure was one thing. When the ground beneath us is shaking, I think it just becomes incumbent on us to just try and stabilize that before we move on to this next level of conversation. Now, of course, the answers that we come to in this debate will affect the way that we go about trying to even stabilize the current situation. But at least for me right now, you know, liberal democracies have yielded some really spectacular results in terms of improving human lives. They have eliminated poverty, even in this, you know, halfway house that you know, we have, that we can't at this stage make the perfect the enemy of the good. And we at least have to, you know, stick with this for a while before we go on to this next level of creating a completely stateless society.
Are you worried that by sort of fixating on the sort of, there's a lot of sort of like Judith Sklar liberalism of fear, I think, going on, and that sort of line, which I'm sympathetic to, But are you worried that by focusing so much on saving the current system, it ignores the extent to which the current system has been oppressive in various ways, rule of all over all sorts of problems, the ways that liberal democracy has sort of covered up systemic issues of bigotry? You've mentioned that there are like compromises in power structure that are quite messy, but to someone with a more radical orientation, they might look more like just sort of putting window dressing on a deeply oppressive system. So do you have any worry that radicals are just missing the boat?
Again, not to get too much into libertarian argumentation right now, but, this is kind of my problem with libertarianism right now, is that it, begins with this perfect deductive system in their head. And then they try and measure the ground reality with this perfectly developed system in their head. And the whole anarchy debate has been fixated on what should this perfect system look like. What this misses is kind of like, the large sociological realities of the real political world, where political solutions get worked out. So, it is, I hate to tell you this, but it doesn't matter what your perfect deductive solution is. Whenever you try to get to it, existing status quo powerful interests that are threatened by it are always going to act up and prevent it from realizing your perfect system. So you are going to need a theory to have to deal with those interests. You are going to have to deal with a way of bringing, getting their buy-in. Otherwise, the transition is going to be so bloody and so messy that, your project will run aground before taking off. So that's what kind of libertarians lack, is kind of like this sociological theory of moving from here to there, and how do you deal with this messy transition where every status quo powerful interest is going to come and try and stop you from what you are doing. And that's what liberal democracies are good at. They are good at forging some kind of a compromise where these powerful interests become an ultimate impediment to the project of removing human oppression. I was actually, recently I've been reading this Harvard political scientist. His name is Daniel Ziblatt, I think. And he has this very interesting theory about, in early 20th century, some Western countries managed to move from sort of their aristocratic semi-feudal system to a liberal democracy, and some didn't. And his theory is that if you look at Britain succeeded to a very large extent, and what happened in Germany and in Austria, they fell into fascism. And so why is it that, England had managed to hang on to some of its liberal democracy and Germany did not? And his theory is that, and I think there is a whole lot to this, his theory is that the conservative interests, the powerful aristocratic interests that were represented by the conservative parties, when they felt that they had an electoral system where they had a fair shot of protecting their interests, they went along with liberal democracy. In Germany, when it became clear to them that they, couldn't protect their interests by allying themselves with the social democrats, these conservative, interests, aristocratic interests, threw in the lot with fascism, and you got a fascist. And to some extent, that explains what's happening in America right now. Why did Donald Trump come, to the fore? The, conservatives and the people in power are so freaked out by the liberal threat that they are going to just tear down the existing structures. They're going to, and the language that liberals to some extent have used of, getting rid of white privilege and what have you has not helped in that dimension. They have become so freaked out that they are willing to throw away, the entire edifice of liberal democracy, checks and balances, everything, because they are feeling so threatened by by their political enemies. So you've got to first stabilize the system and, give these people a reason to, go along with checks and balances and, freedoms and individual rights, or they are going to simply tear it down. So, libertarians need to focus a little bit on how do you get from here to there. And how do you deal with these, powerful interests that you're so worried about, that I'm worried about? I'm extremely worried about them.
Right. And I think the concern that radicals have, not just radical libertarians, but also radical leftists, since, the center deals at the sort of intersection of those two groups, is that there's a worry that you will just recreate the sort of late 20th century stasis of global domination by an unjust, military state, that you will recreate sort of the power structures that they think at this moment are being challenged. And I guess the disagreement comes down to a disagreement about the cost-benefit analysis of the rise of fascist reaction in this versus, the hope of improving liberal democracy into sort of realizing its ideals. But I think there might also be another line of objection that a radical might push at that juncture, that's something along the lines of, does that just mean that you're interested in placating to the fascist authoritarian tendencies in society? Isn't that sort of how we, and they might add, isn't that how we sort of wind up in these stable equilibrium democratic societies that are often quite unjust?
I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but I guess you are asking that if you give half a loaf to these powerful interests, aren't you simply, perpetuating their domination, right?
Yeah, I guess that's the line.
Okay. And like I said, when I started off by saying, I said, I'm both very concerned about, the progressive side of things, like removing injustices and oppressions that are in the system, at the same time that I want to protect liberal democracy from this fascist threat that I see is going to be the, threat of our generation. And how do you reconcile the two? And I'm like, I will admit, I don't have very great answers for you. What I do know is that, I see myself as a progressive libertarian right now. And I want, progressive politics libertarians to embrace a more progressive politics as we go forward. But I think that can be done within the broader liberal democratic framework. I mean, and we were going to talk a little bit about libertarianism's fusion with the right. And I think this is, you don't need to turn your back on liberal democracy in order to, have a more progressive libertarian coalition. I think the reason some of the fascist interests got prioritized among libertarians was because of this fusionism with the right. But that, to me, was a historical happenstance. It didn't have to happen that way. Libertarianism sort of arose in the heyday of the Cold War, when the communist threat was at its peak. And given the emphasis on property rights and markets within libertarianism, the fact that the liberals and the left side was not interested in, that end of things, when communism threatened some very core libertarian principles on property rights, what have you, libertarians allied with that. But that was something of a historical happenstance. And because of that path dependence, libertarians have had a hard time switching to a progressive politics. But I don't see how union with progressivism necessarily means that you need to turn your back on liberal democracy. What you need to do is reprioritize your issue set. So, in our world, in a libertarian world, which is never, the current world is never perfect. I mean, there are always rights violations in every dimension, in every end of the political spectrum. And what libertarians have done is they have prioritized, because of this fusionism with the right, an issue set that helps the powerful much more than it helps, the powerless. But we can reprioritize that. We can now have a fusionism with progressives where we prioritize the liberty violations of, minorities, of low-income people, what have you. But I can see all of that happening within a system of liberal democracy. And what is liberal democracy? Liberal democracy means elections or a peaceful transfer of power. It means checks and balances so that, again, power is constrained. It means an independent judiciary. It means press, and it means individual rights. I mean, that's what liberal democracy is. And how you prioritize those institutions to tackle existing problems depends upon, our own understanding of libertarianism.
Yeah, right.
If that makes any sense.
So you present this, good sort of vision that I think a lot of bleeding heart libertarians in the past have presented of a sort of fusion between progressivism and libertarianism. So, like, I used to be quite active in mainstream libertarian circles, and every time, I would take a line like that, forget the more radical, left market anarchist line I take now, I would encounter a lot of resistance from libertarians who were sort of like so imbued in this fusionist movement as it currently exists that any sort of threat to conservatism they perceived as a threat to their, worldview.
Yeah. Right.
So, like, what do you think the prospects of either a libertarian conservative fusionism or a libertarian progressive fusionism? At this point, I think I'm kind of skeptical of both, honestly. Do you think are the prospects for both now that we've seen the mainstream conservative movement go full right populist? I mean, obviously, the libertarian conservative fusion has grown quite toxic to the point that, various parts of the libertarian movement are kind of hard to even recognize as libertarian.
Yeah.
But it seems to me like almost the opposite of what you would want to happen has happened with libertarianism, that it's gotten more right-wing populist throughout the Trump era than it ever has been. So what do you think is the best way to try to correct for that?
I mean, I completely agree with you on your description of where libertarianism is right now. And like you, I have been hugely dismayed and disappointed by...
disgusted is the word I use.
Yeah, disgust with the way, libertarians have handled the last 4 years. I mean, Trump was the closest thing we saw to an authoritarian in our lifetime, right? And if libertarians were put on this planet for anything, it was to fight this kind of quasi-fascism, strongman politics, authoritarianism. And the best arguments against Trump did not come from libertarians, unfortunately, or at least self-identifying libertarians. Who did they come from? They came from Jonah Goldberg. He wrote some pretty powerful stuff against Trump. The conservatives. On the conservative right, they came from people like Jonah Goldberg. They came from people like David French, who's both evangelical Christian as well as a civil libertarian. It came from, some neoconservatives, embarrassingly enough. And it came from the Jonathan Chaits on the, progressive side of things. So everybody but libertarians took the Trump threat seriously. And I literally wake up every morning asking myself, how could this have happened? And I think there are several, answers to this. One is this fusionism with the right. And, that we were talking about. It was a very, very, the kinds of donors that we brought to the movement. I mean, they were rich people who were interested in protecting their class interest, going back to a previous conversation. I mean, how do you create a healthy libertarian movement, given that there are always powerful interests that are going to dominate it? And that's a real problem. The donor...
In this sense, they co-opted it.
In this sense, yes. I mean, and the donors in the libertarian movement, I mean, I was just quite shocked to see just how much they were motivated by their own class interest rather than this commitment to broader principles. But at this point, what I also see is that there is a growing chasm between, the donor class and the intellectual libertarian class. I mean, the schism that we are seeing within libertarianism had not existed, actually. So one of the good things that has happened with the rise of Trump is it is, smoking out people who were not in it for, a principled commitment, but for their own, self-interested reasons. And I think there is a lot of rethinking going on among libertarianism. I mean, the Bleeding Heart movement arose before Trump, but I see it as sort of like the future of libertarianism, because new libertarianism who are coming into the movement and are going to be disgusted, by the sort of these tyrannical tendencies of the right, are going to find nothing in your, libertarian right-wing fusion, old establishment libertarianism. So the future is going to be with something like a progressive libertarian politics and bleeding heart politics. And to the extent establishment libertarian institutions manage to pivot and embrace that issue set, I think there'll be a future for libertarianism. Otherwise, it'll die. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Yeah, maybe
it
this
will
is
not
just
survive.
maybe this is just the pessimist in me, but the way I've seen it is that the existing infrastructure of the movement is sort of so entrenched in that donor class. And I think there's another schism, not just between the intellectual sort of wing of the libertarian movement and the donors, but also between sort of the populist base of the libertarian movement and the intellectual class, who in some ways are different than the donors. Like, there were a lot of edgy, college students who were bringing Yiannopoulos to campus or whatever. And they were very attracted to Trump, between sort of that wing, the Mises caucus types and the LVMI types. Yeah. They're a smaller but louder voice with less power. But, like, I see them as sort of that being the almost last breath, and without some major institutional reforms of the sort of classic libertarian institutions, it's probably going to die, honestly.
Right.
But just to ask a question, one thing that sort of Will Gillis has challenged me on in the past is I have taken a line very similar to what you have, that the reason for the sort of continuing fusionism, even as the right gets more and more authoritarian, with libertarianism is a sort of historical accident of an alliance that occurred during the Cold War. But one challenge that I have heard is that maybe some of the explanation comes with the sort of internal rhetoric and logic of libertarians' emphasis on negative rights, to the exclusion of a lot of others. So, like, Will thinks that, they said this during my interview with them, Will thinks that what happened was that there was a sort of rhetoric of leave me alone, like, just leave me with my stuff, my money, my property, or whatever, and we'll be fine. And that led a lot of people to sort of extend that to cultural issues. Just let my culture stay the way it was, leave it alone and don't touch it. And if that's true, if it was sort of like there's something to the internal emphasis to libertarianism that leads it to have these massive gaping blind spots, then is there an even deeper rethinking that needs to be done? Do you think that sounds like a plausible theory of the case, or what hang-ups?
No, it does. Yeah, no, I think Will's point about sort of the leave me alone ethos spilling from sort of the level of individual to the level of culture, I think is really well taken. I always thought I started with sort of the standard libertarian formulation, live and let live, formulation that, so long as you're not hurting anybody, that's all, libertarianism is asking you. And, those are the only rights we need to worry about. And but my friend Gauri Lankesh, who was assassinated in India by right wing, she was a famous journalist, ran a tabloid, very, sort of came from the socialist end of things, very progressive, not a libertarian. And she actually, I read something of hers after, unfortunately, she was gunned down in her own driveway. And she was describing the Bangalore, which is this Indian city of her time, before the rise of Hindu nationalism. And Bangalore was this very progressive cosmopolitan city, which was now under attack for precisely its cosmopolitan, ethos by the Hindu nationalists. And she said, Bangalore's attitude always was live and adjust a little, which means space for another lifestyle. The rugged individualist framework in America is that you should not be able to see the chimney of your neighbors because no externality should impinge upon your space. And that's not the cosmopolitan ethos. The cosmopolitan ethos is not live and let live, it's live and adjust a little. And I think that's a really, really important formulation, which is very difficult to actually explain in America because of this sort of this rugged individual. I mean, it's hard to even explain to libertarians, although it is very quintessentially libertarian because of sort of this rugged individualist sort of framework of American libertarianism. But to go back to the Will's point about negative and positive rights, I mean, what is libertarianism? Libertarianism, in my view, and I still call myself a sort of, classical liberal libertarianism has acquired all kinds of connotations I don't like anymore. So what is classical liberalism? And, essentially it is a critique of state power. Essentially, it takes the problem of state power seriously. Essentially, it feels that, state power is the ultimate threat to human liberty and human progress. I mean, and I still take all that seriously. So I'm very much within still the negative conception of rights. Now, within that, I may concede something to, having some kind of a universal basic income scheme. I may concede something to a social safety net, the need for a social safety net, but not as a realization of any kind of like a libertarian, principle, but as a compromise. I see those as compromises that are all right to make because we live in a messy world and we, want to deal with certain issues that people have, so that we can then preserve a space for the things that really matter, which is removing the yoke of the state from the neck of people that are really suffering from it. So it's still very much a negative rights orientation. So what I just want is, the default condition of the world is poverty. The default condition of the world is rights violations, liberty violations. That's how human societies begin. They don't begin in a state of, if you read Hobbes and his Leviathan, in a state of nature, all you have are rights violations. And the libertarian project is to ameliorate these rights violations. And what I want is that these rights violations should focus on removing the yoke of the state or the powerful from the necks of the least powerful and the most oppressed, and then work their way off instead of the reverse, which is how libertarianism has been. Now, to do that, you're going to have to get the buy-in of powerful people. And to that extent, you are going to have to need to make accommodations, but it has to begin with a progressive framework, if that makes sense.
That does. So populism isn't just a threat in the U.S. with Trump. There's also, populism's left and right are sort of on the rise globally. And, having in the spirit of that more cosmopolitan orientation, it's worth paying attention to populist movements around the world. So, coming from India, Modi is obviously like the representation of that movement in India. Maybe fill some of our listeners who aren't familiar with that situation in on sort of what makes Modi a unique populist force, maybe different from Trump in various ways.
So, India has been a liberal democracy, weaker liberal democracy, but nevertheless a liberal democracy since like 1947. After the British left India, the country was parted between Pakistan, which was chose to be a quasi-theocracy, with Islam as the state religion. And India chose to be a liberal democracy and a secular liberal democracy that respected religious pluralism, religious liberty, and, what have you. The India that I grew up in even, so Nehru, whom I mentioned earlier, Jawaharlal Nehru, he had, like I said, he was greatly influenced by continental philosophy, which was Fabian socialist and secular in his time. And so that Fabian socialist secular model came to India. And socialism was not yielding the results that it was supposed to, eradication of poverty and, what have you. India was remained an economic basket case till 1992, till it economically liberalized. But Indians that I grew up in were quite proud of their secular traditions of liberalism and religious liberty and religious freedom. What Modi did was he promised two things. Because there was this huge outcry against socialism in India, this compromise, this formula that Nehru had given to India of Fabian socialism and secularism came under attack from all sides. And Modi wanted to not just undo the economically oppressive side of Fabian socialism, but he wanted to take away secularism also. And so he came to India but secularism was so deeply embedded when Modi came to power in 2012 that he had an uphill battle to get rid of secularism. I mean, he comes from a very Hindu nationalist background. Hindu nationalists are people who think India should be a country where Hinduism should be the state religion, essentially, and Hindu scriptures and Hindu norms should dominate, this country of 1.3 billion people, where there are about 140 million Muslims and about 35 to 40 million Christians, more Christians in India than there are in Canada, than the entire population of Canada. And Modi ran on a development agenda, saying he was going to consolidate the economic liberties, economic liberalization that the previous Congress government had, implemented in 1992, that he would, make them permanent and he would expand them. And that's what, that was the deal he was offering. But when he came to power, he very quickly switched, pulled a switcheroo and didn't succeed on the economic front and has doubled down on this Hindu nationalist agenda. So with the result that at this stage, Muslims who were always a second-class citizen are fighting to even remain citizens. Now, the issue for Muslims in India is not whether they are going to be given some partial religious liberty. The issue for them is whether they are even going to be recognized as citizens of India because of this one very diabolical scheme that he has come up with to get rid of their citizenship status. And I won't go into the details of that. Now, this is like just about as radical as it comes. I mean, like I said, there are 130 million Muslims in India. To not just take away their religious liberties, but to strip them of their citizenship will be an exercise in fascism like you have never seen before. And the trouble in India
hasn't he already implemented like the single largest disenfranchisement in like almost human history by taking away?
So what he has, okay, if you want to get into the weeds, so what he has done is he started something called the NRC, the National Registration Council. And what this NRC scheme did was it required every Indian to prove that they were citizens. And there was a criteria that they had to use, that they were, they've had ancestors going back a certain amount of time, that they have some papers from the government that show that they were born in India and they were citizens. The trouble in India is that it's such an informal economy and such an informal culture that people don't keep papers. I mean, my grandfather did not know his birth date. And there are still many people in rural India who don't even know what their birthday is, much less have birth certificates. So this was going to be a problem, not just for Hindus, not just for Muslims, but Hindus also. So what does Modi do? He then wants to pass a Citizenship Act where he says that everybody in the country, who doesn't have the proper papers will be given amnesty and will be made citizens, except for Muslims. So he's got the first part of the scheme in place. The NRC is in place, but he hasn't yet been able to get this, Citizenship Amendment Act through. And part of the reason he couldn't get it through was before Corona happened, there was this massive outcry in the country and there were protests going on. I mean, after all, there are 130 million Muslims in the country. You can't just squash them overnight. And there are still, rump liberal elements in India who can still speak up. And the protest against the CAA was so massive that it stopped him dead in his tracks. But this is his long-term agenda. And if he gets, and right now the opposition in India, the Congress party in India is so weak that it poses no resistance to his ambitions. So at this stage, it's very difficult to see what is going to emerge in India to stop him, given that not only is the opposition weak, his BJP, the ruling party, has been completely taken over by the cult of Modi, just like the Republican Party has been taken over by the cult of Trump. The courts in India are extremely weak, unlike over here. It would be too much to say that they are the handmaiden of the executive, but they are almost the handmaiden of the executive. And executive checks and balances institutions, the executive agencies are all controlled by the prime minister, and so they can't pose any, check. So there is no real equivalent of the FBI, for instance, to keep Modi accountable or anyone who's in power accountable, which is why I'm at this stage, very protective of these institutions of checks and balances, agencies, and their, independence and what have you. So that's kind of like the situation in India. And, the closest parallel to Modi is Orban in Hungary. But Modi is even more of a problem because Hungary was a late comer to the liberal democratic club, and liberal democracy hadn't quite congealed in Hungary the way liberal democracy had congealed in India. And so if Modi pulls off his feat of illiberalism and religious persecution, that'll be a huge, huge, huge deal, in my view.
Right. What do you think are the lessons beyond, you indicated one, the need to protect institutional norms of checks and balances and that sort of thing. What do you think are the lessons that sort of a global audience can learn from the rise of populism in India?
The global lessons are, so one issue that led to the rise of Modi was that the Congress party was seen as utterly corrupt. When you have a loss of trust in institutions and a loss of trust in political parties because they have been, overtaken by corruption, that's one time when people are willing to throw in their lot with anybody. And that's actually one of the other things I'm worried about with America is that, America and with Trump and the rise of Trump was that for all of the flaws in American liberal democracy, at least at the national level, at the federal level, public corruption wasn't a huge issue. I was in Detroit and Kwame Kilpatrick was a corrupt mayor. But that kind of corruption at the national level was not possible in America. With Trump, you saw a lot of that eroding. He stacked the White House with people from his family, didn't release his tax returns, didn't release any conflict of interest with his businesses. And so the stage that sets for public corruption and the loss of trust in institutions is a huge, huge red flag for the rise of sort of a fascist politics.
Right. And one of the things that I think the right tried to do and has continued to try to do with QAnon is to try to manufacture an aura of corruption in the status quo to try to emulate that sort of atmosphere through various conspiracy theories, whether it's the emails in Benghazi or whatever.
Right. No, absolutely. That's the other part of the trust in institution and public corruption is in India, the public corruption of the Congress party was real. There were sitting prime ministers that were, receiving kickbacks. That has not been the case in America. Yes, the Clintons were sleazy, but the amount of right-wing outrage, the outrage machine in the right that has ginned up the, public corruption of the left, while at the same time giving a pass to the, public corruption of Trump, in my view, is a hugely, hugely bad thing. And it's something that I worry about a great deal. So public corruption and the public perception of public corruption are invitations to tearing down liberal democracies, tearing down faith in institutions, and, throwing your lot in with fascist politics.
Right. What do you think is causing, on the global level, the increase in populism? Because we mentioned Modi on the left. There's people like Elmo. And in France, there was the big movement for Marine Le Pen. In Canada, there was Maxime Bernier and that sort of thing. What do you think is causing this global upswell of populism at this moment?
I have to admit, I really don't have a good theory on it. I just know I don't like all the existing theories of the rise of global populism. The various theories are the rising in income inequality, right? The haves and the have-nots, and sort of how a neoliberal framework has led to that. I don't buy that because the evidence for that is quite weak. I mean, what has happened is a certain amount of stagnation in middle class wages, but there hasn't been an absolute increase in poverty or an absolute diminution in the quality of life or incomes of middle income and low income people. I mean, there's just not very good evidence.
Yeah.
The rich have got richer, but the poor haven't got poorer.
To speak on behalf of that theory for a second, I think the idea is that it is obviously true that the absolute levels have not gone down, but because the middle is stagnated while the top has gone up, it's supposed to like breed this sense of this sort of belief that the middle class has gone down because they're not going up as much as the guy next to them. They sort of compare themselves.
Right. No, look, I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm just saying it's not the stuff of revolution. That's what I'm saying. I mean, I'm not saying this shouldn't be addressed. I'm not claiming
right.
I'm just saying it just doesn't explain this level of disenchantment at the system that would give a rise to this kind of right-wing populism. That's the part I don't get. So that's one theory. The other is the huge cultural shifts produced by globalization. You know, there's social upheavals caused by demographic shifts, immigration. Even that doesn't make any sense because if you look at America's, foreign-born population, it's less than 15%, which is at claimed to be at a historic high, but it's at a historic high because America clamped down and imposed restrictions last time this population reached that level. But that doesn't tell you that just because we didn't run the experiment in the 1920s of having a greater foreign-born population, that necessarily means that, there has to be a backlash against this sort of like this demographic shift. And if you look at, Australia and if you look at Canada, they have far more foreign-born as a percentage of the population, and they haven't seen this kind of nativist backlash that the U.S. has and some European countries have. So that kind of doesn't make any sense to me either. I mean, I do think that there is some cultural anxiety component for all kinds of reasons.
Just look at the rhetoric of these movements.
Yeah, just look at the rhetoric of these movements. I mean, exactly. So I think there are cultural anxieties, and the cultural anxieties are actually the strongest among people who have not experienced a demographic shift. And I think the cultural anxieties stem from a sense of foreboding as to what's going to come. It's kind of what we started with, sort of the loss of existing privilege. Just the idea that your existing privilege and your existing stamp on cultural institutions is being questioned has led to certain cultural anxieties, which is producing this backlash, which comes to my original point that, you rile up these majoritarian, powerful interests too much, and they will tear down the system. I mean, they will put in their lot with fascist politics. And so this transition from this current system to a more, like a progressive, equally liberty-loving system has to be managed carefully. And libertarians really do need to come up with like a theory of how to do it and manage and the tactics for doing it.
One last issue I think we should get to, because at the core of a lot of this populist stuff is an issue that you're an expert on, immigration policy and the demands for immigration. Popular support, if I recall correctly, for more liberalized immigration, ironically, actually increased a little bit during the Trump administration, it seems, almost in reaction to him. So now that Biden has, the White House, he's made some movement in this area. What exactly do you think his goals are? Do they seem good to you, or do you think they're not radical enough? Because you are on board with like open borders as sort of your normative lodestar in that realm, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What is the likelihood you see of Biden getting his agenda across, and what political strategy do you think works to make that most viable?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it actually does intersect with the current conversation we are having. I mean, obviously, there's going to be no president who's going to be good enough for me, because there is going to be no president in my lifetime who's going to go back to the, status quo ante of 1920, where people could just show up on your doorstep and they would be examined for health and what have you and handed their papers. I mean, in my lifetime, I'm not expecting that system to return. So clearly there are things that, he's not good enough for me. That said, he has moved rather quickly in dismantling Trump's legacy. I mean, he used his executive authority very appropriately to get rid of the Muslim ban, to get rid of refugee ban. Those were all steps in the positive direction. Where I'm worried is that he needs to go further, and he will not go, and he could go further because the politics would actually be amenable to it. But he will not is on managing future flows of immigrants. I think he's going to be good in terms of giving relief to immigrants who are here right now. So I think he will legalize the undocumented population. Or he will at least try quite hard to legalize undocumented people in America. He will go much further than Obama did on that front, or he'll try to go much further. There is this huge backlog of green cards for people from India because Trump was so bad and our system is so bad because there are limits on how many green cards people from one country can get, and he wants to get rid of those, which will go a long way towards eliminating sort of this 100-year backlog that high-skilled immigrants from India, for instance, are facing in getting their green cards. So he will be good, or potentially good on all of that. What I've actually just written a piece, what he's not good at and showing very bad signs are easing future flows, which is like key to us open borders types, right? Like we want there to be a system that can manage the aspirations of Americans who want to work with, who want to have immigrants here and immigrants who want to come here. And there are some really bad measures in the proposals that he is pushing, one of which is that he wants farmers who have been exempted from overtime rules pay people who are on what are called H-2A worker visas the same overtime as everybody else. This wouldn't be so much of a problem if he would then expand the H-2A visa or make it more, usable, but he's not doing that. So that's one big problem. The other big problem is he's not expanding any of the other low-skilled visas. There's the H-2B visas, which is for seasonal workers who work in hospitality and landscaping and construction businesses. That has a very tight gap, and he's not doing anything to remove that. And the problem is that he's going to give amnesty to people who are there. He's not going to open more avenues for legal immigration for other people to come into the country legally. And 15, 20 years down the road, you may have the same illegal immigration problem that's going to continue to poison our conversation on immigration, going forward, 10 years from now. So that's the part I'm deeply worried about. So I'm not looking for perfection. Like I said, you've got to manage these things carefully. So I'm not telling him open the borders now, but at least he has to be directionally correct. And on these two things, he seems to be directionally wrong.
What do you think about the steps he's taking on enforcement? So there was a recent big splash about him reopening some of these detention for unaccompanied, non-documented minors. That was, of course, a source of horror during the Trump administration, the way they were run with, they were essentially concentration camps, to be frank. He has decided to reopen these, and the idea is that you need some place to put these non-documented kids when you can't find their parents, although some of them, are more easily available. It's just CBP lacks the resources. It's not CBP, actually, it's ICE.
Yeah.
Lacks the resources to unite them. So do you think he should do more to pour in resources into that front to make it what's the policy solution to undo this mess that Trump has created?
Yeah, no, I think libertarians are jumping to conclusions a little bit on this right now. He hasn't opened, the kinds of concentration camps that Trump did, where he was separating children from parents and throwing them in these detention camps, right? That's not what he's doing. He has opened these detention camps for unaccompanied minors. And there has been something of a surge in unaccompanied minors crossing the border. And Trump had dismantled, the resources, the processing resources so greatly that it's going to take time for him to scale back up. So I'm right now suspending judgment on what he is doing. If this continues, so they do need to build capacity. They need to have, one of the things that Trump did was move immigration judges out of immigration onto other things. So there is, that whole the whole court system and processing system for these applications has to be rebuilt. So and it is going to take a little bit of time. I think there is an element that, he does not want to move too quickly in processing these, because he feels that if they start processing these applications too quickly, they may become a magnet and they may not be able to deal with the surge on the border. And of course, that will also bring out the restrictionists and the nativists in droves. So right now, I'm flagging this as like a worry, but wait and watch. There is a great deal of pressure he's facing from the progressive immigration advocate side, who are not going to take this lightly if he goes down some of the, using restrictionism as deterrence kind of like, motif that Trump was using. They are quite on high alert. I'm on the board of the Free Migration Project, which is kind of like a left-wing version of Open Borders. And they have like this whole campaign to get rid of the entire detention system in America. And so if Biden starts to build that up, he's going to get a whole lot of resistance from that. And so I am sort of like flagging it, but not raising the alarm bell on some of the border stuff right now.
All right. Awesome. The last question I always like to end the podcast with is, what are 3 books or articles or, interpretive dance pieces, whatever, that you think are relevant and germane to this conversation that you'd recommend to the audience?
So The Constitution of Liberty by Hayek, I think, is kind of like a Burkean progressivism that I am in favor of. And in that spirit, Hayek's essay on why I'm not a conservative, even though he was a Burkean, I think those are, those two. And actually, the third one will also be a Hayek, which is The Use of Knowledge in Society. I think that's like...
Yeah, it's a classic.
I mean, it's like, I think that was when I read Use of Knowledge in Society, and the way I started approaching issues of economics and markets completely changed. That's the kind of like, to me, that piece is like sort of the model of sociological reasoning that I think libertarians need to engage in much more, much less of this deductive stuff of like, minarchism, anarchism, and trying to work out like, in your head what the perfect system is, and much more like sort of ground-based, reality-based, sociological-based, and his defense of markets and how knowledge is dispersed and prices allow this coordination problem to be solved, I think that's a great piece. So those 3 things.
Awesome. Well, before we get out of here, plug some stuff. Where can people find your writing? Where can people find your work?
No, it's a good question. Now that I'm not with it, not at Reason, don't have one single home, and I'm writing for many different outfits. Best thing is to follow me on Twitter and follow me on Facebook. For now, I am thinking of starting my own website. I'm also, very quickly before we leave, I'm also working to start something that I'm calling the Institute for the Study of Populist Authoritarianism. And the idea behind this, and the idea behind it is because libertarians were got so flat-footed in in recognizing, the threat of populist authoritarianism from the right, I want to develop classical liberal resources to be able to do this in future. So the idea is that, we have all these anthologies that combine Hayek's and von Mises and Friedman's writings on the problems of socialism and central planning. But, Hayek and von Mises also had experience with Nazi Germany, and they wrote very eloquently about the problems with fascism and the threat of fascism.
Liberalism and the classical tradition, for example.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And so one part of that project would be to start creating a resource bank of those, writings. There are other elements to it too, but anyway, I'm working on that. I'm talking to a whole bunch of people. I've had a very enthusiastic response. Now, if I can find the right donor class for this, then we are in business.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Thank you for coming on. This was a good
Thanks for having me, Zachary. Lovely. It was good fun. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I'd like to thank Shikha again for coming on and having such a lively and informative discussion. As I mentioned earlier, if you like this show and want to support what we do, you can support us on Patreon. If you decide to do so, you get special bonus content and swag as a thank you, including free books, buttons, zines, special credit at the end of the show. We also have a Patreon-only podcast featuring roundtables on current events with C4SS staff called the Outgroup. And it also helps our sister podcast, the Enragés, a new interview series hosted by Joel Williamson with C4SS writers, and Green Market Agorist with Logan Glitterbaum. If getting goodies while supporting those podcasts, this one and all the other work we do sounds appealing to you, then go to patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's patreon.com/c4ss.org. And here's a special thank you to our current associate producers on Patreon: Stacey Jamal, David Colburn, Derek W., Ackneralls, Humanisphere, Alex Skakowski, Curtis Ekman, Danny O'Brien, DT, Grant Gold, Jacob Sykepin, James Tuttle, Jared Ferguson, Jason Turner, Lindsay Jane, and Tara Lynn. Thanks to all Patreons for your financial support, and thank you for listening.